He once stood shoulder to shoulder with striking miners demanding justice equal with them, with nothing to his name. Today, he sits among South Africa's wealthiest billionaires, presiding over companies that span everything from fast food to platinum mining. But few have ever seen the full story of how the workers' lawyer from Soweto turned into the corporate mogul of Sandton, or the trail of betrayal that came with it. How did Cyril Ramaphosa become a billionaire despite never starting a company or never inheriting anything? He is not a self-made man, nor a trust fund baby. So where did the money come from? Through shady black empowerment deals, boardroom politics and billion-rand mergers, Cyril Ramaphosa quietly became one of the wealthiest men in South Africa. And yet behind his speeches of renewal and equality lies a history of privilege, connections and corporate power that crushed the very same people who once raised him to fame. Yes, not only did he become a billionaire through state-sponsored BEE deals and ANC connections, he also betrayed those he once claimed to stand for, the black working class, in order to amass this wealth. By the time the dust of the radical political transformation of South Africa in the 90s had settled, Cyril Ramaphosa was no longer merely a political figure. He was leading an economic empire from glass towers of Sandton to the sprawling plains of his game farms. His wealth spread across almost every sector of the South African economy. And through his company, the Shanduka Group, Ramaphosa has held stakes in telecoms, mining, energy, finance, fast food and logistics. MTN gave him exposure to the African telecom boom. Standard Bank and Alexander Forbes ensured a foothold in finance. Sasol Mining and Optimum Coal tied him to the energy sector, and his control of McDonald's South Africa brought the golden arches of the global capital directly under his brand. By 2010, his business interests had multiplied into dozens of subsidiaries and cross-holdings. Bidvest, Max Steel, Pan African Resources, London Platinum, and vast agricultural estates in Limpopo and Mpumalanga. His wildlife holdings, among the largest private game reserves in the country, became playgrounds for foreign dignitaries and elite gatherings. Estimates place his net worth at around 6.4 billion rands, or just under $500 million US. Yet, behind this unprecedented rise to wealth lies a dark irony, that the fortune which elevated him to national sainthood was not only built on state-sponsored takeovers of formerly white-owned companies, in which he was given shares for free, but also on the exploitation and suppression of the workers he once vowed to defend. One that would blow up in dust and gunfire on a minefield just north of Rustenburg. Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa was born on 17 November 1952 in Johannesburg, and when he was 10 years old, his family moved to Soweto. He initially attended school in Soweto, but he eventually matriculated from Mpapuli High School in the homeland of Venda in 1971. Interestingly, one of the main reasons his family sent him off to Venda for schooling was to ensure that he received a thorough introduction to his Venda roots and receive an education in accordance with his cultural background so that he could foster a deeper connection with his Venda roots, which was of course the exact aim of the apartheid government's tremendous emphasis on Bantu homeland education. Ramaphosa's Venda heritage is very significant as he is the first ever ANC president to not come from one of the three major tribes in South Africa, the Xhosa, the Sotho or the Zulu. In fact, in terms of sheer numbers, the tribe he comes from is only around 1/10 of the size of the others, and a smaller minority than even white Afrikaner or Anglo-South Africans. After completing high school, Ramaphosa also quite significantly attended a university that was specifically tailor-made to Venda and Tsonga students from the region in and around the Venda homeland, the University of the North, located just east of Pietersburg, a city which is today known as Polokwane. Here, Ramaphosa studied law and first became active in politics, joining the South African Student Organisation or SASO and the Black People's Convention or BPC. Here, he took the lead in organising mass rallies in celebration of Frelimou's victory against Portuguese in Mozambique. At the time, Frelimo was recognized as a terrorist organization by not only the South African and the Rhodesian governments, but also by the Portuguese government in Lisbon, the USA, and most other First World nations. Subsequently, Ramaphosa was detained for 11 months under the Terrorism Act. After his release from detention in 1975, Ramaphosa returned to Johannesburg and continued his law studies through the University of South Africa or UNISA, obtaining his B.Proc degree in 1981. During this period, the political landscape of South Africa was hardening. The economy, particularly the mining industry, was being shaken by waves of industrial unrest among black mine workers. Ramaphosa's legal background and his experience within the Black consciousness movement made him a leading candidate to take the lead in helping shape this new labor frontier on the mines. He was initially employed as a legal advisor to the Council of Unions of South Africa, which tasked him with spearheading the establishment of a new miners' union that could organize the hundreds of thousands of black mine workers who at the time lacked any formal representation. It was in this capacity that Ramaphosa co-founded the National Union of Mine Workers, or NUM, in 1982, and it became its first general secretary. Under his disciplined, loyally leadership, the NUM rapidly evolved into South Africa's most powerful union by far, growing from a few thousand members to more than 300,000 within just a few short years. This transformed Ramaphosa from a former student detainee into one of the most influential black leaders in the country. But what began as a crusade for the rights of miners soon became the launchpad for amassing one of the greatest personal fortunes in modern South African history. Ramaphosa's meteoric rise in the NUM not only gave him national prominence, it made him indispensable to both capitalists and politicians. He was no longer just a lawyer for the workers, he became the bridge between the boardroom and the barricade. By the late 80s, the NUM had become the single most powerful trade union in the country, with Ramaphosa serving as the interlocutor between the mine bosses and business elite on the one hand, and ANC leadership with its growing political influence on the other hand. When the transition to a new multicultural dispensation began in the early 90s, it was none other than Ramaphosa who was called to sit across the table from the National Party in the CODESA negotiations. In 1991, he was appointed the new Secretary General of the ANC, and by the time Mandela's presidency came to an end, both Thabo Mbeki and Ramaphosa were tipped as possible successors. Although many had expected Mandela to pick Ramaphosa, Mbeki was picked as the successor instead, and Ramaphosa quietly left the politics and moved into the business sector. But of course he did so with all the political connections he had established in the ANC over the course of the 80s and 90s. Through the ANC's newly established Black Economic Empowerment Program, Ramaphosa founded the Shanduka Group in 2001, an investment holding company that became a textbook example of how political access in the ANC translated into vast private wealth for the very few politically connected elites after apartheid ended and BEE was imposed. BEE legislation, supposedly designed to redress racial exclusion, required large corporations to transfer significant equity stakes to so-called empowerment partners. Few figures were better positioned to take full advantage of this law than Ramaphosa, a former trade unionist who had negotiated the democratic transition and still commanded enormous political goodwill inside the ANC and the Mine Workers Union and all other unions alike. When Shanduka was founded, major companies were under pressure to demonstrate black ownership. And so, for the sake of self-preservation they turned to figures like Ramaphosa, respected, well-connected and politically safe, as their empowerment partners. In these arrangements, Shanduka did not have to pay any cash up front for any of the shares it received, and the risks were virtually eliminated. Instead of corporations themselves or their financial subsidiaries providing vendor financing, essentially loans to purchase the shares, repayable from future dividends that those very shares would earn. In many cases, Shanduka received preferential share structures such as A-class shares that earned higher dividends or had guaranteed buyback clauses. Ramaphosa simply exchanged political goodwill for financial capital in this convenient wealth creation scheme. If the companies performed well, Ramaphosa's holdings ballooned in value. If the companies didn't, the debt could simply be quietly scrapped. BEE laws not only made Ramaphosa's investments so that he never had to pay for them up front, but they also made them completely risk-free. Ramaphosa would enjoy all the benefits of ownership of these companies while being completely shielded from any of the risks. Within just a few years, Shanduka held major shares in MTN, Standard Bank, Sasol Mining, Alexander Forbes, Bidvest and even the South African master franchise of McDonald's. Shanduka's portfolio also extended into coal mining, logistics, energy and property, sectors heavily regulated or influenced by the government policy of BEE. These deals were often financed through vendor loans and preferential share structures like we discussed earlier, meaning that Shanduka could buy into billion-rand companies with no upfront capital and repay the loans from future dividends. A privilege not many ordinary South Africans ever enjoyed. And so, by being a privileged and connected ANC cadre, Ramaphosa could sit back and see his wealth surge as a result of the BEE laws, while ordinary black South Africans continue to sink further into poverty under ANC mismanagement and corruption. Ramaphosa raked in hundreds of millions in profits simply because he was black. And not just because he was black, but because he was part of the small black elite which could benefit from this new BEE scheme. A scheme that, in retrospect, was probably designed from the very start to benefit these politically connected few elites, like himself and his brother-in-law Patrice Motsepe, who, as the wealthiest black man in South Africa today, now has a net worth of over $3.5 billion. Ramaphosa's political pedigree opened doors unavailable to others. Executives sought him out precisely because his presence on a board signaled political protection and easy access to the ANC, which means easy access to power. By the mid-2000s, he was a director and chairman on more than a dozen corporate boards, earning fees and share options worth tens of millions. When Shanduka merged with the Pembani Group in 2015, its combined valuation exceeded 20 billion rands, cementing Ramaphosa's transition from unionist to ANC oligarch. The consequences of Ramaphosa's transformation became painfully clear in August 2012, when police opened fire on striking miners at Lonmin's Marikana Platinum Mine, killing 34 and wounding scores more. The former so-called champion of the workers was no longer on their side, or on their side of the barricades. He was leading Lonmin's board of directors. On the 15th of August 2012, the day before the massacre, he wrote several very angry emails characterizing the strikers at Lonmin as plainly dastardly criminals that must be characterized as such. Ramaphosa then also called for concomitant action to address this situation. And while the official commission of inquiry into the Maracana massacre did not make a finding of criminal liability against Ramaphosa, it is safe to say that this tragedy destroyed any illusions that the ANC elites, spearheaded by Ramaphosa, were on the side of the very black workers that had propelled them into power in the first place. The illusion was thus over. Ramaphosa is a man who did not hesitate to organize violent strikes and protests when he could politically benefit from them during the days of apartheid, or even after apartheid ended, when he wanted to pressure large mining companies and other companies into giving him preferential shares for free. He would employ the working class to do his bidding, to go out and strike, to make things impossible for the company to go forward until he got his shares, and then he would call them off. But when similar strikes started on the other side and started to cost him money, he did not hesitate to support the violent suppression thereof, trampling the very mine workers he supposedly claimed to represent as he rose through the ranks of power. And he had no problem with killing them. And so the man who had risen from the shafts of the goldfields to the summit of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange had come to embody the very contradiction of the multicultural Rainbow Republic, a state built on premises of equality, yet ruled by the beneficiaries of its own corporate revolution. Ramaphosa's path of destruction did not end there, however, by any means. In a recent video, we highlighted how the raw economic data itself unequivocally point to the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa is by far the worst head of state this country had ever had, especially economically speaking. Check out our report by clicking on this link appearing on your screen right now. And do consider supporting our work by becoming a paid member of the Willem Petscher Group. Without your help, we cannot change the hearts and minds of people. Simply follow the steps on the banner on your screen. Goodbye and God bless.